Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us today. We're going to continue our journey through the Daodejing, and we are currently in chapter 32. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get started.
Niño aprende muchas palabras en la clase.
So we'll just kind of jump into the text here. And just a quick comment about the last couple of weeks. There was the last couple of chapters, there's a real heavy emphasis on how, in a sense, governing policies were being criticized in terms of their use of force or coercion in terms of trying to bring about their solutions. So there was a heavy critique of things like weapons, and in particular about war and how that should be treated more like a funeral whenever you see that kind of massive loss of life. This chapter is going to continue with some of those same things, but it's going to be looking at a little bit more from the positive perspective of how things could be done in a different way, at least the way that the Taoists are understanding it. So this chapter starts off, and the translation we're looking at here is the Feng in English. That says, "The Tao is forever undefined." And this is widely translated or translated in widely different ways. I'm going to bring up what the actual text is here because it's kind of interesting. It's got very key elements from chapter 1 here. It's literally Tao, constant, absent, name. Right? So we've talked about absence and presence and kind of that duality, but absence can also be the idea of simply no. And so Ming, or name, we've looked at in chapter 1. It talked about the things that are named versus the things that are nameless. And so here we're talking absent name. So that would be this idea of no name. And then constant was kind of the key in that first sentence when it says that the Tao that can be Taoed is not the constant Tao. And we explored how constant has to do with, what things persist. And within Taoism, it's kind of this almost ironic thing that the only thing that's actually constant is change. And so you've got this idea that there's this Tao that is always kind of the way, in the sense of this pattern of how the world functions, things like what we may think of in terms of natural laws, gravity, and so forth. So here we have Tao and constant being brought back together, along with this idea of no name. And so I think we can kind of look at this in a couple of different directions. The translation here is using constant as forever, which is a somewhat problematic way to, I think, to translate constant, because it gives a little bit of the wrong impression, is that somehow Tao should be looked at as something that is static and eternal and doesn't change. Whereas really it's more the idea that the idea of change is constant, that cycle is constant. So we just kind of need to keep that in mind, that when we're talking about that constant Tao, or that the Tao is constant, because there's a couple different ways that maybe that could be translated, is at the core of what Taoism is trying to talk about. And then we've got the idea absent name or no name. So here it's saying undefined, but I think if we remember the concept of naming, especially for how this chapter is going to unfold, it's going to be important. So in that chapter 1, where we had the critique between the named and the unnamed, it was the unnamed was that prior state, that state of wu or absence, where things were kind of that absence that wasn't nothing, but it was the substance, if you will, that has the capability of becoming something. When we talk about coming into the you or the presence, the manifestation is being made up of whatever we want to think of that you, or excuse me, get my words tangled up this morning, the absence, the Wu, right? So the absent name or no name is really helping us to think about that aspect of the Tao, the part that is hard to get a handle on because you can't see it, you can't touch it, taste it, smell it, whatever, but we see the effects of it in the sense that it ends up manifesting in these different ways through the 10,000 things. So this is part of what we're really bringing back to the fore with this opening line, is kind of a reminder about what do we mean by Tao. We're talking about this pattern of constant change that is what makes up everything that is, but in its state prior to being manifest, it's unnameable, it's undefinable, it's there's no name. The name comes with this idea of taking the whole and breaking it into parts. And the names become a way of separating, of categorizing. And the danger of that is that they're always going to be secondary, right? So there's a whole that exists, and we arbitrarily decide to identify parts of that whole as a thing, and we give it a name. The danger is we start to think about those things as being separate, and that the name is what it is, as opposed to a label that we put on top of things that is helpful in terms of how we navigate our world, but it's not the ultimate reality. So referring back to that Tao, it says small, though, in its unformed state. And here, unformed state is coming from the Chinese character for pu. That's a funny word. But this is actually the term that can be translated as simple or simplicity, but it's where we get that term uncarved wood from. And how this chapter is going to unfold, this will be important. So it's essentially saying that the Tao is small, in this case, when it's in its uncarved, or we might say natural state. And then it continues to say that it cannot be grasped. And when we're thinking about grasped here, we want to think about it in the sense of trying to control or subjugate. Right? So the Tao, it's small, you can't get a hold of it, you can't control it, you can't subjugate it. And before it's actually manifest in this idea of something that's present, it's got this idea of uncarvedness. It's still this idea of that uncarved wood. So then we get back to the leaders, and we can see where this is going to go back to kind of more of a political thinking. So when we're thinking about names, when we're thinking about grasping, we want to make sure we're kind of orienting ourselves now to the context of governance, right? How does naming play a role in that? How does grasping and control play a role in that? And here it's suggesting what happens if they don't go down that road where there's normally this ability of trying to carve, trying to cut, carving that wood to get things to conform, to control, and also how the names are used to order and organize things is all part of how they're thinking about this idea of governing. It says if leaders could harness it, meaning the Tao, the 10,000 things would naturally obey. And we're thinking, well, how would that work exactly? And they're going to kind of give us an example here. It says, heaven and earth would come together and gentle rain would fall. Now, this is rather symbolic in the way that it's looking at this. We've got the two kind of main divisions of how they talk about the cosmos. When they say heaven and earth, Tian Di, it's meant to encompass everything. When it uses something like the term all under heaven, it's referring to essentially like the human social world. So here it's talking about everything. would, in a sense, function to provide some of the things that are like core to how life functions, this gentle reign. And that's going to be something that is extremely important to all life. And it says, people would no longer need laws, and all things would take their course. Now, I know this is going to bring up a lot of questions, probably. Why are they saying that people would no longer need laws and that everything would just take its course? So it's bringing up kind of a interesting concept now that we'll continue to explore, but there's something about this idea that Tao is small and uncontrollable that is nonetheless this pattern, this constancy, that if it is actually implemented or taken a hold of, or taken hold is the wrong word, but if learning to kind of come into harmony with it, that something about that, it's saying, would allow everything to kind of do its natural thing, including people. This idea that there's a reason that there's laws and that those laws have to be there is a consequence of how the social system is trying to be controlled. That is that attempt to carve that order, that structure, and get things to fit that don't naturally fit, that's requiring this idea of laws, that if you weren't trying to do all this carving and fitting everything into place, that it would be a completely different situation where people didn't actually need laws and everything would just kind of fall into place. A couple of different translations here of this passage that I think are worth noting. First one is from Benjamin Huff. The people, without being commanded, would then behave as equals. There's definitely this idea of equality that's behind how this sentence is translated. So we can see how he kind of pulls this together. And then another one from Ames and Hall says, and without being ordered, the common people would see it as distributed equitably. Very interesting takes on how to translate this, that really challenge a lot of our common sense and how we think about people. And that if we didn't have laws, if we didn't have some kind of constraints, that people would just run amok and it would be total chaos and disaster. So how in the world can they be proposing that people are just going to naturally do what they need to do if you take the laws away and you start to actually act in accordance with the Tao? Any thoughts about that?
One thing that appears to me is that this is really dependent on scale, in the sense that if you look at human societies as emergent complex systems, then it's not that this person does this or that person does that or so and so creates laws. It's more like as the size of a human group grows, laws and rules are something that emerge at a certain scale, because at like tribal scale, Dunbar number and below, you know everybody and you care about everybody, so you want to share with everybody. But at larger numbers, there's more people than you can know. Most people, especially in like a large city, most people are anonymous or strangers to you. So we can't rely on the same sort of norms and customs that would cause us to be fair to our family members or our neighbors to operate across large numbers of strangers at scale.
Yeah, and just in case people aren't familiar, the Dunbar number that you mentioned is roughly 150 people in terms of our ability to maintain and know people.
Wow, that's a lot lower than I would have thought.
Yeah, basically the idea is that most of our ancestral history is in small tribes of 100 to 150 people. So neurologically, we have the ability to form close connections with that many people. But people who have like 500 friends or something, they're not very close with most of them. We can only actually form close connections with a limited number of people, no matter how many superficial connections we may have.
Yeah. Excellent stuff, Dane. This is, one of the core things that I am endlessly intrigued about with the Daodejing is it appears to be preserving this kind of Paleolithic perspective, which definitely would have been more at that hunter-gatherer stage of how humans socialized, as opposed to the really radical, probably the most dramatic shift that has ever happened in human history was that transition from that nomadic life to the settled agrarian life. And the consequences of that have been incalculable. And so we find ourselves in an interesting situation. And classical China, when this is being written, would have been in a similar boat, because you're talking about an empire, the Zhou dynasty, at this just prior to this kind of disintegration into the Warring States period, that had basically coordinated this entire region under a single leadership. And so it was definitely well beyond, small tribes. It was a large empire that was utilizing more of that kind of forced hierarchical design of how you maintain civil relationships amongst strangers by providing kind of a humanly induced pattern, in this case, if we're talking about laws, of what's acceptable behavior when we're talking about community. So we definitely have an interesting shift that they're suggesting. And I think we might think about that idea of small with Tao in a similar way, that the ultimate pictures that they give us in the Daodejing, especially as we move towards the end of what culture would look like, is definitely this idea of smaller communities that are kind of self-sufficient, that are maybe next to other communities, but there's not like this desire to feel like you have to go next door to the other community. You've kind of got everything you need here, and we can wave at them and see them, but ultimately, we're just participating kind of in our own little group next to other little groups. That may be completely unrealistic in today's world, but I think it's worth noting what happens in terms of the shift required to manage these larger groupings of humans. We kind of brought up a lot there. Anybody have something else to comment on?
Yeah, well, certainly, you can't live, I mean, you can't go backwards in the sense that Paleolithic sustenance practices won't support the global populations of hundreds of millions or billions. But it just occurred to me, Jim, that the description of people can see their neighbors across their valley, but they're content to just let them be there, and they don't need to visit or wander. Like a person might live their whole life in their own little village and not feel a need to go outside of that. Actually, just now it strikes me as the state of Paleolithic life in general, in that in these small bands there'd be, well, prior to the agricultural revolution, you have small bands, 100 to 150 people. When they got to be bigger than that, they'd split off, and another smaller band would go start somewhere else. Uh, and people, and like the idea of traveling, there might be a sort of seasonal following the herds or something, but the idea of traveling was not something that many people did. It was just occasionally some person would go like wander to see what was over the horizon and see other tribes in more parts of the world. But usually people would stay in their home groups, and so the idea of a stranger was almost didn't exist. Like people were always around people that they knew their whole lives. And if you saw a stranger like once in your lifetime, it would be a really big deal. The idea of a stranger didn't really even exist almost.
Yeah, it'd be curious to find out about how likely that would be the case. But because I know, well, I shouldn't say I know, but I believe I recall reading about how there would still be times where even these nomadic groups would kind of meet up for exchanging of, let's say, partners and that kind of thing for how
Right, it would be like a ceremonial thing once a year, maybe, where the different related tribes would get together. But the idea of today, you walk to the grocery store and you pass a dozen strangers on the
right.
way,
Yeah.
that is just totally different from that kind of urban
Yeah.
setting.
Exactly. And the other thing that's kind of interesting then too to note is how the Taoist picture that's being presented in the Daodejing of more the ideal setting is not nomadic. It's a village. It's still kind of the settled idea. There's still this idea of homes. So it hasn't like completely reverted back to saying we need to go back to hunter gathering or give up technology. There's still this idea of homes and how they're doing their farming, but they have incorporated maybe some ideas to try and take that shifting in the technology or let's say the population that exists in the area to accommodate those feeding concerns, let's say, or other things that happen, but in such a way that it's still trying to enable this inborn natural capacity for care and concern of one another that happens when we're in communities where we know each other. And I think, Dane, that one of the key things you brought up is that idea of anonymity that really allows for a lot of the destructive behavior that we see. It's reading a very interesting book right now too. It's what is it called? How to See Someone, I think it's called. Brilliant essay that's being done about how we interact with other people, but he really makes a good point of what happens when people don't feel seen and how that becomes extremely destructive when people are isolated, lonely, feel like they're invisible, and what kind of behaviors, both self-destructive and outwardly destructive, that kind of experience brings in the human condition, because we are designed to be in community. We're not designed to be alone. And so, I mean, there's so many different pieces of this that are moving at one time, but bringing back this idea of how could we structure things in such a way that we're in this community of people where we actually have some kind of vested interest in identity and connection could go a long ways towards more of a hands-off way of approaching things. Probably most people are going to say that's idealistic and it's not going to happen. But it is interesting to note how differently groups behave when they're smaller versus larger and what the implications of that are. There's definitely trade-offs. I know Dana and I were kind of hogging the time there. Martin, you had something to say?
From the beginning, from as you started, when talk about the harnessing and immediately the following statements, even up until now, it all feels like in this particular scenario, we're talking about release of any kind of a social construct or any societal development, and we're just going back to primal behavior almost. And it feels a lot to me like hive mind, when we still have someone who's harnessing in the 10,000 things and controlling things for that matter. And then we have the others, even though it may be much more of a flatter structure at that point, but it still feels like there is some difference between some and others. And I not only we're saying that people will behave like equals, will perceive it as everything is distributed equitably. It still is not. It feels in the description, and you're not needing laws and stuff like that. It just all feels like we're removing all the individuality and all capability to be individual and have people having their own mind, and like, where's the good things that are being taken away from in this scenario as well? Like, where's the innovation? Where's the support? Where's uh the seeing of the inequality that exists? Because things are never, I don't think it's ever going to be a situation where everything not only is going to be perceived as equitable, but will actually be equitable. So where is that support for those where it's not equitable? Um, so yeah, it feels really, really like we've lost self-control, and everything is becoming more deterministic than it probably should or is. That's how I'm reading all of this.
Yeah. Maybe think about it like this. Imagine more of an extended family. So maybe grandparents, possibly grandkids, but definitely parents and kids. And it would have been maybe a little bit more of an extended amount of children at different points in history, right? And imagine more of an, I'll say, ideal setting, because I know many of us did not have good experiences with family. But that's not, there's a lot of factors that go into why that's the case, right? So let's just assume for the moment we've got a healthy environment that's producing healthy people that have healthy families, just for the sake of argument. So within that family, you're going to have a wide variety of differences, right? You're going to have maybe the elderly that are living with you that are in need of care and support, and you're going to have the very young that are in need of care and support, and you're going to have younger people and middle-aged people, and they're all going to have different capabilities and skill sets. So, if we're talking about a farming family, there's definitely going to be hard work that's going to need to be done. So people who are able to handle that are going to be prized for that kind of effort. And we're going to see a lot of domestic stuff that's going to need to happen, caring for all these people. And you tend to find a little bit more of, in more historical contexts, gender defined kind of roles around those things, simply because of the natural abilities to handle the different type of workload that's required. And so you definitely have differences that are recognized, but within that community of that family, if you're thinking about something like dinner, again, assuming it's a healthy family, it's not going to be like you're not going to share the food with the kids, right? I mean, you make sure everybody's got what they need. And there's an effort that's done to think about how is this family going to go forward and how are we going to continue to do what we need to do. So there's all kinds of efforts around, how do we make sure the house is working well? How do we make sure the field's going well, that we've got all the things that we need to continue through the winter and into the following years? How do we raise the children and help the parents of the children with, the extended group of people that come around that? So it doesn't take away this idea that there are natural distinctions between people or that there are different skills between people. It's more of, without somebody commanding you, again, healthy brains, healthy people, they don't have to command you to love your children, or for the children to love their parents, or to care for your elderly, or to, do all the things that need to be done. You just do it because you just naturally care about these things without it having to be commanded. That is more along the lines, I think, of where they're thinking that this what's the word?
Equitability.
Well, there's that, but it's this idea that it's not that everybody gets the same amount of food, right? Like, When my kids were little,
Oh, for
there's
sure.
no way they're eating as much food as I do. Right? There's going to be differences, but it's what they need, and it's what I need, and vice versa. We're working to make sure everybody's got their needs met, as well as, finding the ways that we can work together. And that's, I
I don't
think,
know, Jim. It's starting to sound like communism. It's already failed.
well, we're just talking about families, right? So it's what happens, I think the Taoists are saying, that allows the family to have these kind of dynamics without anybody commanding them to do so. And if they are actually holding on to more of this Paleolithic remembrance of what life was like in that context, we know from a lot of the anthropologists that in that hunter-gatherer context, there was built-in pro-social wiring into our brains that prevented things like strongmen rising to power. It wasn't effective for how we existed in that context. The strongman rising to power really wasn't something that became socially beneficial until we moved into more of this settled agrarian kind of a context. And I know there'll probably be some debate about that, but let's just run with it for the moment. There's something we can definitely say about healthy family relationships that do not require somebody telling you how you're supposed to do it. And I think that at a very fundamental level, that's what they're trying to get at here, is when you start to impose unnatural ways of grouping people and forcing them to behave, maybe with this larger extent where now you're having more interaction with unrelated people. That is where you now have the introduction or the need for things like laws.
Okay, I hear you. Thank you for expanding on that.
Yeah, well, it's definitely some very weighty concepts that are not typical to our normal ways of thinking, that can seem outrageous, and maybe they are outrageous, but at least we can try to understand where they're coming from. Anybody else have some thoughts on this?
The level of the family, you have not only this scale working in favor of harmonious coexistence, you also have heredity and biological relatedness.
Mm-hmm.
Our biologically speaking, our altruism is at least to a large degree motivated by kin selection. So we're more likely to be more generous with our siblings than we are with our cousins, and we're more likely to be generous with our cousins than we are with perfect strangers that we're not related to, etc.
There may be something to that as well. A lot of interesting discussions on what exactly is that altruism. Is it just another way of kind of labeling something that ultimately is more selfish behavior, or is it genuine? And there is some interesting debate on that. The other thing that's interesting is when we think about what the human superpower is that allowed us to become this world dominant species. At its core, what they would say that made us prosper is our ability to cooperate. So we normally think about, how we're a warlike species, but really it's our ability to cooperate and work together that allowed for the massive changes that have happened in the world. And that, of course, led to larger groupings, which may have had some disastrous consequences when we kind of outgrew our context for what we were normally intended for. Well, intended is a bad word, but what we kind of evolved for. That's maybe the question that we're trying to understand is, what do we do now? Is there a way that we can learn from the past to influence the present that isn't necessarily going back? And I appreciate within the Daodejing that the ideal image that they hold is not going back to this nomadicness, but it's still using within that agrarian context, that settled life with the technology they had at that time in terms of houses and carts and, you know, domesticated animals and farming, that was still part of the picture. So it wasn't a get rid of technology or revert back to an earlier way, as much as it was, how can we take those ideas and work it out in our current context, which would be definitely our challenge here. So it goes back to then thinking about this idea of government. Once the whole is divided, the parts need names. So we're getting back to the naming thing and why this is important. So this character, I believe it's pronounced G, or possibly more like a chi type of a sound, is interesting because it both means or can be used for this idea of cutting or this idea of carving. So we talked about Tao as uncarved, and now we've got this idea of cutting, this dividing of the whole. And then that same word is also what's used to convey thoughts of essentially government or governing. It's kind of like, I don't want to say divide and conquer, but it's part of how that process kind of goes, is there's kind of a cutting up and ordering, a structuring that happens, which is where they get this concept of governing from, and why the word for cut and govern is essentially being used almost interchangeably. So you'll see this line translated in some ways of, you know, once you start to rule or govern or something like that, then you have to come up with these names. Or here it's kind of picking up on the cut aspect. Once the whole is divided, the parts need names. And we definitely want to think back to the first line of this idea of the Tao being unformed or uncut. And then this idea here now of the cutting that's going on, that's dividing. And then because of that, the result is that we need names. Now, not just names in terms of how do we define our world and how do we navigate it, but if we're in more of this political context, then we have to think about names in the sense of how things are trying to be ordered or regulated or ruled. And I can't help but thinking about so much of the craziness that's going on right now in terms of how words are used and the debates about words and all the minutia of how things are getting split, that makes it almost impossible to know how to act sometimes, because you don't want to step on the wrong toes. And there's so much of this, just different ways of looking at things. So we definitely see the more that you kind of interfere and get involved in trying to figure out how do we order this thing. And even if we're trying to figure out how to do it fairly, we end up creating all these different categories and all these different names and trying to figure out how do we order this and structure it, that it becomes, you know, kind of this, you know, within software, when we start to build things that kind of just generation after generation of coders become so complex it ultimately collapses on itself. They call it the collapse of complexity, you know, and that's kind of what I feel like is happening sometimes. The way our social or governmental system is happening is it's becoming so complex through all the different laws and all the different case settings and all the different cultural agendas that are all trying to take hold of it, that the division has become so minute and the names so numerous, it's almost paralyzing. And that's kind of where they said there's already enough names. We need to know when to stop. Knowing when to stop averts trouble. Maybe I'll pause here for a second too to see if there's thoughts on this idea.
I was gonna say I can see how this applies today with your example, Jim, like totally. But I'm wondering what made them feel this way.
What made them feel this way?
Yeah. Like I wonder what issues they were going through that made them feel this way.
Well, I think clearly one of the debating partners that we see within the Tao Te Ching is the Confucius way of ordering things. But there was also the legalists and some other groups that existed at that time. And ultimately, they were having similar problems in the sense that there was definitely this thought that things need to be ordered and structured in a certain way, and people need to kind of understand their place. And if everybody did their part, then that would kind of resolve this whole issue of this warring chaos that's going on. Taoists are just responding back. You guys are not getting the picture here that ultimately what's happening is a result of the attempt to try and get things to conform to your idea of order, as opposed to letting things operate according to their natural way of doing things that's generating this issue. So it's going to be a lot of the things that we wrestle with in terms of when things become intrusive. If within a corporation, if it becomes too much of a micromanaging type of a situation, the employees are just completely stifled and can't actually do their jobs, and it's not good for the company. If a country becomes too micromanaged, then, again, same type of thing. People don't know what they can actually do or how to even engage. And that if we have a little bit more of a hands-off kind of an approach, not to say that we need to have no rules or guidelines, but I think the Taoists would argue that we need to have the ability to question, especially rules or guides that are based off of values that are maybe not justifiable. Like, I believe they would be totally fine with the idea that you have to pick which side of the road you're supposed to drive on. And everybody
I hope
gets
so.
right, because it's logically it makes sense. Yes, it curtails my freedom. Yes, it's telling me what I have to do in this context, and it's limiting those behavior options, but I can see the value of it, and so I'm happy to do it. And I think that's kind of the core that we would want to look at for a lot of these ideas. Is too many of our things are not justifiable, or we ended up with laws because of some very unique special interest groups that were, bundling in laws with something about, how do we feed the homeless? And we just end up with this tangled mess of things that needs to just be rethought in terms of, how do we really justify any time that we're trying to figure out, that we're going to be asking people to sacrifice some aspect of their liberty, which has to happen whenever you're talking about community. There's always the balance between the group needs and the individual needs, but they just need to be clearly justified, I think, would be more the lines that they would be looking for. And the problem is that often they're not justified, and that they are having groups that have special interest that benefit where the masses don't, right? That the masses end up being kind of conscripted into some larger program that they don't really benefit from. Just like we saw with the passages when they were talking about war. It's all the same kind of stuff we're still dealing with. It's like human nature is still the same. It might be a very different context when you're dealing about, wagons and horses versus, spaceships, but we're still wrestling with the same challenges of how do we get along.
It's interesting that so far after, we're still struggling with how to get along.
A little bit scary too. It's like, oh, are we ever going to actually learn?
Yeah. I hope so.
I'm encouraged that we actually do see a lot of progress in areas that one of the limitations of human experience is that we recognize we have an over reliance on our particular experience. So it could feel like we're wrestling with a lot of violence that's going on in our world, but if we look back historically, it's dramatically decreased. And the experience that we have is not helping us to understand that, because it's only relative to what we are experiencing versus what we would desire. So I think there's definite progress that is being made and will continue to be made. And I think some of these new tools that are availing themselves to us are going to be very interesting in that regard. Whereas I know a lot of people are very concerned about ideas of artificial intelligence and how that might get used. I'm very intrigued by how things like AI or even things like YouTube and social media are giving a voice to so many more people and giving access to participate in technology in a way that's never been possible before. That is going to potentially allow for greater connections and ideas to emerge out of this democratizing of technology that could be really powerful in a positive way.
I have a very strange feeling about AI because I do art, and there's obviously a big problem with that right now. And I saw something the other day that was like, I never imagined that the AI would be the one writing and doing art, like writing poems and doing art, and that the humans would be the ones like stuck with accounting and like doing the numbers games, you know?
Yeah. It
So
is.
if you break it down into what is art, how do you make? I was just watching yesterday a little short about is art versus a tool, or production versus art. What the difference is there? Using tools to achieve something, using 3D printers to replicate the same thing over and over and over again, and stuff like that. If you kind of break down what is art for you, and then what AI can or cannot do, there's a definite some overlap versus critical thinking. I was also yesterday doing Q&A for trivia for our business consulting group, and I would ask a question, say give me three trivia questions with 4 answers, one of them correct and whatnot. And even though the knowledge, there's a cutoff for the ChatGPT knowledge, it's even if I was asking about things that are way within that knowledge cutoff, it would give me the wrong answers. Like very plain, like who are the members of the family Madrigal? Like very simple knowledge answers, and it still got them wrong. I'm like,
Wow.
Yeah.
creating random stuff, I think, is more up its wheelhouse, and art, you could argue, could be a more random, or not not a very organized thing to do, but doing something factually correct based on all the information that's out there, misinformation that's out
Yeah,
there.
that's what I
Different
read. It has
backgrounds,
a
right?
hard time, like Chat GPT has a surprisingly hard time with numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
Lots of interesting stuff.
yeah.
Let me just kind of get through the end here because time is flying.
I know. We always run out.
I don't know.
So this is part of how it concludes, or not part of how it concludes. This is how it concludes. It says, Tao in the world is like a river flowing home to the sea. And they kind of simplify this a little bit. There's a little bit more that's going on here. It talks about valley streams flowing into rivers and rivers flowing into seas. And here, I think, is the key thing. If we think back to that opening lines where it talks about the Tao being small, and then taking that small here, we can see this progression of how these small things kind of end up forming these larger things. And if we're thinking about, they talk about the dew or the rain coming from heaven, and how that functions. If we think about these streams, rivers, and seas, there's these small things, right? These little raindrops or these dewdrops that end up gathering together and forming streams that then go into rivers where the streams join together, and those rivers ultimately go into seas, but nobody's telling them what to do. right? It just kind of naturally forms and naturally happens. And I think that's another way that they're using water to really think about the nature of Tao, which brings us to kind of how I want to kind of pull together some of these thoughts. So Tao is being presented here as that it's small, or that small gathers into large without top-down control. It's kind of a key aspect of what's being presented in this chapter. The parts just know what to do. Don't have to be told, don't have to be coerced, don't have to be carved. And little things make a big difference. So that rain or that dew that's falling ultimately gathers together into things that are more and more substantial, streams into rivers, into seas, which makes some interesting parallels with a couple of key things in our modern scientific thinking. One of them is complexity theory. And what is fascinating about this is how much can be accomplished in a system of individuals that are interacting with each other around some just very basic rules of how the parts interact with each other. And crazy, amazing things unfold. If you think about, one of the classic examples is how starlings kind of do their things as birds, where it seems like this interesting black cloud that's moving in very strange organic ways. And you're like, wow, how are they doing that? And it's not that there's any like conductor saying, okay, everybody go this way, now everybody go that way. It's just each bird knows, it's kind of programmed with what to do based on what the bird next to it does. And when you add all those things together, it ends up creating this very interesting experience that looks like it's somebody designed it, but it's really just the result of a bunch of small things with some basic rules that, when they play out, make very interesting things. We could talk about, even within our body, the trillions of cells, and even the other, parasites that are essential to how we live, that are part of our body. All of that is being, every piece just has to know what it does based on the pieces next to it. There's no orchestration of the whole thing. The whole, this emergent aspect of what we see, is the result of all the little pieces just doing the little things that they do. And connection with that is chaos theory, which is the idea that, especially when we're dealing with very complex systems, little things make a big difference. So the famous line is, the butterfly flaps its wings, and I always hear different places of where the butterfly is, but let's say he's in China, and all of a sudden you've got a tsunami or a hurricane that's happening in Florida, right? It's the idea that in very complex systems, all the pieces matter, and little things that you don't take into consideration can end up having large consequences. And so if we think about this basic critique and how this applies to how humans try to do things, it's like exactly backwards. Instead of starting with the small, or we could say the individual people, and going up through the natural interactions that they have and what types of environments do these create, we're going the other direction, where we're starting at the top and trying to control and force and form a particular way of being. And the Taoist critique is that's where that resistance comes from. But the Taoist perspective is that there's a natural tendency towards order and complexity that happens when the individual pieces are just simply allowed to do what they do. Anyway, a lot of stuff, but we're kind of at time. We can have a few quick questions. And I did notice there was something in the chat, but I can't see the chat, so I don't know if there's anything important there.
One of the things that has been bothering me through most of this is that I'm thinking about the Muslim dominance in parts of the world, and how, if you introduce these concepts, it would have, I just can't even imagine that they would take hold, because they would throw them out saying that's impossible. You cannot operate that way. You have to have the laws and things. So
well, I don't think it's just the Muslims. I think there's a lot of people who would say the exact same thing. But I hear you. There's definitely power groups that I think the biggest concern I hear most often is that if we actually did this, there would be, strong groups that would just take advantage of everybody, that they would just ride over everyone who was trying to play nice. And I want to do some more research into how the social structures were working in more of this hunter-gatherer context, in terms of how they kind of created a context in which strong men weren't really able to, it didn't give rise to them. Because maybe some of those things would actually be ways we could incorporate back into what we're looking at. But I mean, we're deep into a particular way of thinking and social structure that definitely favors the rules and the control and all that kind of thing. So it's not an easy one step, just start doing this. But I think at an individual level, the more we start to think about these things in terms of our personal behavior, it has consequences, right? If the ripple effect from that complexity theory, or even the chaos theory, is that the individual pieces matter, then how we start to conduct our lives, how we interact with other people, is going to have an impact. Maybe it's not going to change everything right away, but it has that capacity. Well, we're definitely at time, so maybe we'll have to leave it at that. I want to thank everybody for joining us. And if you're watching this as a video and you'd like to be a part of the live discussion, you can register your email at kinship.cafe. And if you do that, you'll get emails for links to this live Zoom conversation on Friday mornings, as well as, if you happen to be in the Southern California area, directions to where we meet in person on Sunday mornings. And with that, I'll just thank again everybody for coming today.
Thank you, Jim.
Bye. Thanks, Jim.
Take care.